James Riddle Hoffa was not a man who moved quietly through the world. He was a force of nature, a compact, muscular man with a relentless drive that propelled him from the poverty of a young life in Indiana to the pinnacle of power in the American labor movement. By the 1960s, as the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Hoffa commanded the loyalty of over 2 million workers. He was a man defined by his contradictions. He was a fierce advocate for the rights of truck drivers, fighting for their pensions and safety, yet he was equally comfortable negotiating in the shadows with the highest echelons of organized crime. Those who worked with him remembered a man who possessed a photographic memory, a man who could rattle off freight rates and contract clauses without consulting a single note. But he was also known for a volatile temper that left little room for dissent. He was a creature of routine and a master of the iron-fisted negotiation, holding his subordinates to the same punishing work schedule he kept for himself, often operating on nothing more than black coffee and a few hours of sleep. Throughout his life, Hoffa lived in the public eye, constantly under the scrutiny of federal investigators, particularly Robert Kennedy, who made bringing Hoffa to justice a centerpiece of his career. Yet, Hoffa remained unfazed, navigating the legal battles and the political heat with a stubborn, almost mythic self-assurance. He was married to Josephine Poziwak, and despite the chaos of his professional life, his home life remained a constant, though it was frequently punctuated by the inevitable presence of government agents and business associates who trailed him everywhere he went. By 1975, however, the world Hoffa had built was beginning to fracture. Having served time in federal prison for jury tampering and fraud, he had been released on the condition that he would not participate in union management, a restriction he fought with every resource at his disposal. He was a man who felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, losing his grip on the power he had spent his entire adult life cultivating. On the afternoon of July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa drove his maroon-colored Mercury Marquis to the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in a suburb of Detroit. He was there for what he believed was a meeting to smooth over tensions with high-ranking labor and criminal associates, a meeting that was intended to be the start of his comeback. He was dressed in a conservative suit, carrying only what he needed for a routine afternoon of business. He parked his car near the entrance, and witnesses reported seeing him pacing back and forth in the lot, looking at his watch, clearly impatient for the arrival of the men he had expected to meet. He was seen at approximately 2:30 p.m., looking toward the driveway of the restaurant, waiting for a car to pull up. This was the last time anyone would ever see James Riddle Hoffa alive. He was a man who had survived countless investigations, union rebellions, and the full weight of the federal government. Yet he was undone by a simple routine appointment on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The car he was waiting for never arrived, or if it did not leave any record in the memories of those who watched the lot. The hours that followed would transform a man of immense influence into a ghost story that would define the American underworld for the next 50 years. His disappearance was not merely a missing persons report. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through every level of society, from the docks of the East Coast to the halls of the Justice Department, marking the start of a decades-long search for a man who had become too big for the world to ignore. The transition from the routine of a suburban afternoon to the clinical execution of a criminal abduction is where the narrative shifts from the public persona of James Riddle Hoffa to the cold reality of his final hours. The men who orchestrated this did not view Hoffa as the legendary icon of the labor movement. To them, he was a structural impediment, a man whose hubris had convinced him he could reclaim a throne that no longer belonged to him. The logistics of July 30th, 1975, were designed to exploit his specific patterns. They knew he was a man of punctuality, a man who believed his word was still law, and they used that belief to lure him into the open. The maroon Mercury Marquis that pulled into the lot was not a vehicle of chance. It was a mobile cell. Witnesses who were in the vicinity, looking back on the day with the clarity of hindsight, recall the moment the car pulled up to the curb. It was not a violent scene of struggle that would have drawn attention. No shouting, no gunfire, but rather a conversation, a momentary pause where Hoffa was convinced, perhaps with promise of a new meeting location, to slide into the backseat. In those seconds, the influence he had wielded over American industry, the millions of dollars in pension funds he had controlled, and the decades of political favors he had traded were all erased. The car moved toward the exit of the lot, merged into the afternoon traffic of Telegraph Road, and simply became one of thousands of vehicles moving through the Michigan heat. The inside of that car became the final, private theater of his life. Those who have analyzed the mechanics of the crime, including former investigators who spent careers chasing these shadows, describe a process that was terrifying in its efficiency. It was a classic rub-out, carried out by individuals who operated with a disciplined, ruthless adherence to a set of rules that were written in blood, not in law. There was no need for a messy public encounter. The environment of the car provided the isolation required to silence him. Whether he was struck down in those initial moments of the drive or taken to the residential site on the west side of Detroit for a final, systematic end, the outcome was the same. The car traveled through the landscape of the Midwest, passing the homes of working-class families and the industrial arteries of the city, while the most powerful man in labor was effectively ceasing to exist. The silence that followed was orchestrated with the same precision as the meeting itself. The people involved knew that the success of the operation relied entirely on the absence of a trail. They were not acting out of spontaneous rage, but out of a professional obligation to their syndicate. They treated the event as a necessary administrative adjustment to the power structure of the Teamsters. As the sun began to set on that Wednesday, the trail had already been scrubbed clean. The parking lot at the Machu's Red Fox was just a stretch of asphalt again. The payphone was just a piece of telecommunications equipment, and the maroon car had returned to the city to be cleaned, scrubbed, and integrated back into the anonymity of the urban sprawl. The investigation that would launch hours later, once Josephine Hoffa realized her husband had failed to return for dinner, was fighting an uphill battle against a clock that had already stopped. The men who had conducted the meeting were already back to their lives, maintaining their alibis with a calm that defied the magnitude of what they had just set in motion. The narrative of Hoffa's final day is not one of a grand dramatic conflict, but cold, quiet removal of a man who had become a liability in a world that dealt in secrets, leveraging the very structures he had helped build to ensure he would never be heard from again. The transition from the final moments in that maroon Mercury Marquis to the eventual disposal of the body is where the reality of the mob's efficiency becomes truly unsettling. Once the target was secured, the operation moved from the public chaos of the suburban streets into the dark, internal logistics of the Detroit crime syndicate. The residents on the west side of Detroit, often referred to as the House on the Hill, served as a central node in this web of activity, a location where the boundaries between legitimate labor negotiation and criminal hit work were permanently blurred. Former federal investigators and syndicate insiders who eventually broke their codes of silence suggest that the house was not merely a place for sit-downs, but a site designed for the total neutralization of problems. It was here, shielded by the privacy of a private residence and the tacit compliance of those who held power in the neighborhood, that the finality of the act was solidified. The individuals who carried out this phase of the plan were not foot soldiers. They were senior-level operatives who understood that the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa was not just a hit, but a structural realignment of the Teamsters Union. They were disciplined, methodical, and operating with explicit approval of the highest levels of the Detroit underworld. The transition from the house to the final disposal site in Hamtramck reveals the degree to which organized crime had integrated itself into the industrial infrastructure of the city. The waste hauling and recycling plants in that area were the perfect instruments of erasure. Equipped with heavy industrial machinery, specifically large-scale augers and shredders designed to process tons of cardboard and bulk waste, these facilities provided a means to distribute remains across the country in a way that defied traditional forensic search methods. The logic was simple. If you reduce the organic evidence to particles and integrate them into the shipping stream of the national economy, you're not just hiding a body, you are atomizing it. Investigators who spent years piecing together the timeline believe that Hoffa's remains were likely processed in one of these machines within hours of his arrival at the facility. The sheer volume of material processed at such a site meant that any trace of DNA or physical evidence would be dispersed into the cardboard waste supply, eventually ending up in manufacturing plants, shipping warehouses, and landfills from coast to coast. This was the ultimate safeguard against the corpus delicti, the body of the crime, which is the foundational requirement for a murder conviction in a court of law. By removing the physical manifestation of the victim, the syndicate ensured that even if they were identified as the ones who kidnapped him, a prosecution would be an agonizing, if not impossible, undertaking. This methodology was not a stroke of genius, but a testament to the cold, industrial reality of mob operations in the 1970s. They did not rely on sentimentality. They relied on the crushing, relentless output of the machinery they had come to control. The facility burned down shortly after, adding a final tragic layer of destruction to the evidence trail, as if the site itself had been purged of its secrets. For the families of the victims and the agents who hunted for the truth, this realization was the final blow, a confirmation that the man who had been a titan of the labor movement had been handled with the same indifference as the industrial waste that was processed through those giant gears. The narrative here is not one of a dramatic chase, but of an absolute, systematic industrial process that turned human life into a footnote in a ledger of organized crime, buried under the weight of 1,000 tons of processed debris and the silence of a city that knew exactly what had been done but dared not speak a word of it. The mystery of Jimmy Hoffa remains an open wound in the American story, a narrative that has stretched into the 21st century as one of the most impenetrable cold cases in our history. After the events in Hamtramck, the investigation devolved into a decades-long pursuit of ghosts, characterized by frustrated agents, thousands of hours of unproductive surveillance, and a constant stream of tipsters looking for a payday. The government's inability to deliver a conviction was not for a lack of effort. It was a testament to the tactical perfection of the disappearance. The men who orchestrated the event understood that they weren't just fighting the law. They were fighting history, and they ensured that history would have nothing to hold on to. Over the years, the search for Hoffa has led investigators to dig up horse barns, concrete garage floors, and sections of landfill in New Jersey, each effort driven by a fresh lead that inevitably collapsed into the same familiar void of evidence. These excavations became almost ritualistic, a public performance of justice that invariably ended with the same disappointing result. For the families, the case became a lifetime of waiting for answers that the underworld guarded with a religious intensity. The mythology surrounding the case grew so thick that it became difficult to separate the genuine intelligence reports from the urban legends, and for the agents who worked the case, it represented the ultimate limitation of institutional power. They were operating in a world where the rules were subverted by an adversary that played a much longer game. As the original suspects have died off, taking their secrets to the grave, the case has shifted from a criminal investigation into a historical monument of the era. The enigma is no longer just about where he is. It is about what his absence says about the power dynamics of mid-century America. We are left with the knowledge that the man who shaped the modern labor movement, who navigated the brutal corridors of both the boardroom and the mob, was ultimately claimed by the very forces he helped cultivate. His legacy is etched in the pensions of millions and the laws that govern labor, but his final chapter remains a testament to the terrifying efficacy of the syndicate that he thought he could control. The case may be technically unsolved, but in the annals of history, it is defined by a chilling clarity. A man of immense stature was removed from the world with total efficiency, leaving behind only the haunting question of how such a thing could ever happen in a nation of laws. But the story does not end in the silence of Detroit. It lives on in every one of you who seeks the truth behind the shadows. The journey we have taken today reveals that power, when stripped of ethics, eventually consumes itself, and the man who defied fate ended up being swallowed by it. We close this dossier, reminded that some secrets are not meant to be uncovered and some stories are destined to remain in the darkness, waiting for the truth to be buried forever under the weight of time and the silence of those who kept their pact until the very end. Subscribe to Mind 74. If you reached the end, thank you for being the best adventurers out there. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a dossier. Comment below. What do you think happened to the man who couldn't be broken? Share this video with your best friends and join the hunt. We'll see you at the next mystery. Keep exploring.